Hey everybody, welcome back to 10% True. This channel is not monetized, I don't advertise on it, and there's no way for me to make money by you watching this video, which is why you don't have to sit through any adverts. If you do want to support me though, you can always buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description for that, or you can visit the 10% True website and grab one of these fantastic t-shirts. That way you look cool, I make a couple of dollars from the sale, and everyone wins. Anyway, I'll let you get back to the scheduled programming. Enjoy. Starbaby, welcome back to 10% True.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So about 6 months ago, 9 months ago, you volunteered your services to ask to provide an AMA and ask me anything for the Wild Weasel based on your time as an F4G EWO and thereafter as a Wizzo/EWO in the F-15E. Now, not that that's to suggest that the F-15E is a Wild Weasel platform, but you did kill SAMs flying the F-15E. And anybody who wants to watch the Mosul SA-3 video, I'll provide a link to that. And then there's a series of Balkans type stuff that Starbaby talked about, SAM killing, I think in the first episode of that too, in the F-15E. Anyway, I'm taking myself off on a tangent. That's no good. So anyway, you set yourself this challenge. I think you and I both expected it to be fairly well embraced, but it ended up being a huge stream of consciousness on the Discord server. It was about 6,000 words by the time we closed it down, and I pared that down to about 2,000 words worth of actual questions. So the task today is going to be to go through that and try and answer as best we can. And all I've done really is I've just taken out the ones where you flat out said, no, I'm not answering that, but everything else where you said that's a reasonable question and or whatever, I've kept in. So that's the only editing I've done to this list of questions. And for the audience at home, we're going to go through this chronologically. We've only got 2 hours, so who knows whether or not we'll finish it, but we'll do our best. Good to go?
Yes, and this doesn't rule out the fact that we still want to do a live one later, but the workload is stacking up for Steve to get a bunch of content out, so we'll just say it's going to happen unless I get run over by a bus or something, and then you're out of luck.
Yeah, and just to add a slight additional qualification to that, because it was so big, it was at 2,000 words, and the fact that whenever we've done a live stream with Starbaby in the past, the questions have flooded in the live chat, we just thought there's absolutely no way it's conceivable that we would do this and make a dent in it. So yes, absolutely. Record as much as we can now, and then I'm sure there'll be appetite for a live session where people can just post questions at the time, and we won't take anything ahead of time for that, I think, because otherwise it will be impossible to get through. Now, Nux asked the first question, which is, what are your thoughts on the effectiveness of the Spang mixed force of F4G and Viper teams in Desert Storm compared to a single platform working on its own?
Well, we actually had numbers on those. And so remember that at the time, the mixed force was put in because the number of F4s was dwindling. And so rather than have an F4G, F4E pair, where the F4E was carrying Shrikes, you ended up with an F4G, F16 pair, in which the F16 had harms, and later AMRAAMs as well. So it wasn't quite the SAM-killing team that a pair of F4Gs would have been, because of the difference in the sensors and the difference in what the two aircraft handed off to the harm. But it did give you an extra shooter. It simply meant that the F4G was doing all of the control. You told the F16 where to shoot and what to shoot at. And combat results showed that that was effective, but the harms were not as likely to hit their target as they would have been if an F4G had shot it. And that's purely in the difference between the APR-47 and this was pre-harm targeting systems. The F-16 didn't have it. So you've got a guy who is basically hand jamming data into the harm based on what the F-4G tells him to do across a voice radio. So obviously that's going to be less effective, but it did work.
What would the F-16 guy have seen then? Would he have seen a picture of what the seeker head of the harm was looking at? Or was it purely you just saying, here are some coordinates, plug those in and send the missile that way?
Yeah, here's some coordinates. Here's your target. We would call it a slap shot, and we give a bearing and range to the target and the type of target, and line the guy up and shoot it off the nose.
Do you think it's quite similar to what the Ukrainians are doing now then?
It is similar to that. I think very much so. The difference is that we wouldn't shoot two missiles. We wouldn't direct the F-16 to shoot a pair of missiles. And if it had to get off the rail, like right now, it's coming off the F-4G.
I want to keep asking questions about that, but let's go with the list because let's be fair to the people who took the time to post the questions. So Amram Missiles asked, what do you think of the F-15G concept and having a chin pod for all the ECM stuff that could have made the A/C Eagle into what the F-16C is today for the Wild Weasel mission?
It would have been vastly superior. It did not. The later designs did not involve a chin pod. So by the time the mid-90s rolled around, the McDonnell Douglas program was called Headhunter. And everybody thought that the F-15G was going to happen because, well, duh. And so what they did with the antenna array is the F-4G had, as your mid-high band antennas, had a group of 10 antennas looking left, right, forward, and aft. So that's why you've got the little football-ish thing on the tail. It's bigger than it was on an E model, because that's our aft-pointing antenna and our aft-pointing receiver array. What the Headhunter program did is by that time, flat plate receive antennas were really entering usability. And so they had an antenna on door 3 right, another antenna on door 3 left, and another forward-looking antenna in front of the canopy. So that's how it handled the forward look. The Headhunter did not develop a rearward-looking antenna with that degree of accuracy because there was no way to stick a flat plate out there. So it's entirely possible that Headhunter would have accepted just an antenna that tracked the signal without trying to locate it through the tail quadrant. Or it's possible that we would have utilized some element to the ALQ-135, which is our jamming system. So because the project didn't go forward, that tail quadrant was never resolved.
So is that a conical antenna in the back of the F-4G then? Is that so? It's a sort of spiky, sort of shell type looking antenna. Is that what you mean?
No. That's the same little domino shaped antenna that you see on the side of the nose. And underneath that chin fairing, behind that little radome, that's another domino. It's just your 10 element domino array. That's 40 of our 52 antennas right there. 4 groups of 10.
And if I remember correctly, so door 3 on the F-15 is the one directly behind the radome. It's the big sort of clamshell type
yes,
door
exactly.
that opens up.
Door 3, you bet.
They would they have been quite big then? And would that have made a difference to the quality or the ability to triangulate or sort of pinpoint the location of a threat or an emitter?
It would have been bigger. It should have made a difference. Well, so there's a yes and a no in that. Right down the bore line, a bigger antenna should result in a narrower direction of arrival calculation. Okay, what happens when you start getting far off the edge, like to the 45-degree point? I actually don't know the antenna specs. Now that's not unique to a flat plate. Our diamonds had the same issue, but they were pretty good out to that 45 degrees. So in theory, just because of a larger antenna size, it should have been better, and it might have been able to get better coverage in lower frequencies as well.
Okay. Maxim Schenk. Gosh, this is quite a long one. Thoughts on the transition from the F-16CJ to the F-35A in the seed roll, and sort of goes on to say, are there similarities between the transition from the F-4G to the F-16CJ?
The F-4G to F-16CJ transition was a disaster, and you can see it when you watch, part 4 of your Wild Weasel. In that right up front, it's clear that we've got a pilot who was in early in the late 90s and who never got the benefit of a handoff from the F-4G community. It just did not happen. And I think the Air Force, to some extent, made that not happen without putting any effort into the transition. So if you went from Wild Weasel 1 to Wild Weasel 2, Wild Weasel 2 is actually a failure. But Wild Weasel 3, Wild Weasel 4, Advanced Wild Weasel, there was a handoff because those were often the same guys transitioning. We did not make a handoff. The Weasel school closed. The whole infrastructure to put people through a specific Weasel school, that closed. That went away. That was months worth of training. That wasn't a 2-week course, here's your pod. And so the handoff of the seed knowledge, it was a disaster. And all of that extra knowledge was flushed down the toilet, tactically, technically, everything else. And one of the reasons I refer to the F-16 as the mild Weasel is specifically because it's a multi-role aircraft. SEAD is a mission that it does, but it is not their only mission. And all the Wild Weasels go down the line. Their primary mission was killing radars. Yes, we did air-to-air. Yes, we practiced air-to-ground so we could better kill radars, but you would not have taken an F-4G and say, go fly a close air support line. And you can do that with a Block 50, 52 F-16. So that means that the Air Force, having flushed electronic warfare more than 20 years ago and not even having that knowledge in the service anymore, is in a worse situation because now you have the Cub Scouts of the SEAD mission, guys who are earnest and try really hard, and they're handing it off to another community that hasn't even got their own airplane sorted out in detail, and now has to work through that. The other thing is, and this is something I don't know, one of the things you do in a Weasel platform, and the Viper guys do it too, is you troll for SAMs. The idea is to get the SAMs to engage the Weasel element so that they're not a threat to the strikers, because the Weasel element's better able to handle it. And if you look at the Gulf War, you'll say we find there are 21 engagements in which a Weasel pair was engaged. 21 full-up, launch, guide, attempt to hit, not abandon the shot in flight. In 14 of those 21 engagements, the engaged Weasel F-4G went defensive and the wingman killed the SAM. So what that tells you at that time, against the Iraqi air defenses, is that if you tried to shoot at a Wild Weasel aircraft, 2/3 of the time you were going to die. And so now you have a low observable aircraft, which reduces the detection range. How are you going to troll for SAMs in an LO aircraft? How are you going to protect the strikers when the first indication that you and your LO aircraft are going to get, you start collecting trons? Those radars are on the air for a reason, and the reason is the strikers. And so I think that it may very well put them behind the power curve. And of course, the lack of an EWO, that's going to put them way behind the power curve.
Let me ask 2 follow-ups on that then. So I guess devil's advocate as a civilian, somebody who's not been behind the curtain and doesn't know the things you know, but is that the answer to your question is that if the strikers are not low observable and the threat or the adversary thinks that they're going to detect them at a certain range, so they'll turn their radars on, search for them, start targeting them, they may do so with a false sense of security if they don't know that the F-35 is there. And if the F-35 has this all-singing, all-dancing ability to suck up all the trons in the atmosphere and put together this fantastic picture, and then they can target based off of that, then presumably that's the answer to the question, isn't it?
No, so the air defense guys are not morons. They're going to know that the F-35 is present. They are not necessarily going to know where the F-35 is, and we're hoping on that, by the way. Because while the F-35 has a remarkably good low signature when it comes to RF, it's also got the hottest, biggest thrust engine ever put in a fighter. So there may be some trade-offs there. We have yet to see how that's going to turn out. But it may be that you're right, because remember, the purpose of defense impression is mental. And so knowing that there's a guy out there that you can't necessarily see is going to make you uneasy. It's not necessarily going to prevent an air defense operator from doing their job. But it may make them quicker to shut down if they get an indication that a harm or an ARGM is in the air. They battle of wits there. It's all about intimidation.
Do you get the sense that culturally the F-35 guys are and girls see the Wild Weasel mission differently than maybe the incoming CJ guys did? I mean, it felt to me a bit like, with this revelation that the F-16 CJ guys didn't think of themselves as Wild Weasel, that not only was the electronic triad being dismantled, but the mentality and the mindset of that mission was also going away. Do you think that the F-35 guys talking about being weasels heralds a return to that mentality and perhaps, I don't want to say a more serious approach to it, because that would suggest the CJ guys have gone out and not cared about it. But there was somebody on the Discord channel the other day, someone saying, I think the 20th Fighter Wing at Shaw, whose mission is CJ, don't train for seed or something like that. I don't know what the truth of that is, but do you think can you read into it in any way? Does it matter?
It's not the platform guys that I would be so worried about. So you can have all the best intentions of the world, but if you don't have the training and the systems and the base knowledge, you can call yourself anything you want and say, yeah, we're weasels, and that's great from a heritage perspective. But I will say that the United States Air Force will not have a serious Wild Weasel capability ever again until they put a Weasel school back in business.
Do you think it also demands then, you've already referenced not having an EWO, I guess you could say, well, in Vietnam, when they went from radar warning receivers that just showed you a spoke and a signal strength to something that would give you a synthetic indication of what the threat was, the old bears, EWOs said, well, we don't like that. We want to see the raw returns. Do you think it's the same sort of thing? Do you think that for you to get back to a proper Wild Weasel platform, you have to have somebody in the back?
Not necessarily, but I think it will be better. What you do have to have in the airplane, regardless of whether or not you're a 1 or 2-seater. I mean, the obvious future Weasel is an F-15G derived from the EX. But if you take that notional F-35 pilot and you put them through an actual Weasel school and have an actual Weasel squadron, you're going to get a better capability than you have for the Air Force's ever since 1996 half-assed approach to defense suppression.
Yeah, I don't know if you said it on any of the podcasts or just to me privately, but you said that you're referencing the, what's it called, the sort of Wild Weasel pilot school or something, which is sort of 2 weeks long, I think you said.
Well, so that's an electronic combat pilot. So that's an ECP school. That's a 2-week course on how to do pacer wares and stuff. That's not even close to a Weasel school, and that's why I say, the Air Force let the CJ guys down. They should have put a Weasel school into action, and that's going to go double for the F-35. That's my meter stick. The Air Force has talked a good game about getting back in electronic warfare for 20 years. That's all blue smoke and mirrors. When they're serious about getting into the seed-killing, radar-killing, seed kind of operations, you're going to see it because there will be a Weasel school. And until that time, they're not serious. Again,
love to ask more questions about that, but let's move on. Okay, so there was a follow-on question from Maximum Schenke. I'm not going to mention the person's name, but there is somebody who's well known for saying that he didn't really believe that the harm was a great weapon. He would much prefer to use CBU or something else to kill a target. So he was more of an advocate, I guess, of deed rather than seed. What's your opinion? I know you're not going to shit talk a fellow aviator, but what's your opinion of that argument?
That's complete, utter, and total bullshit for a number of reasons. One, as I pointed out before, CBU-87 is not your weapon of choice, I think, against anything when you can use something like an airburst GP bomb. The second thing is the time restriction, in that I can get a harm in the air in a handful of seconds from a substantial distance. And I let the rocket motor give it in, saying that, oh, well, hey, I need to kill a SAM now, so let me just get my stuff together and run in and drop some CBU on it. That's a time thing, okay? You're going to blow your timing. With a harm, you can potentially interrupt, and we have interrupted a SAM engagement and force them to shut down. You can't do that with CBU-87. The risk of going in on a SAM site with CBU-87 is substantially higher than harm because of the distance, and you can't shoot a preemptive CBU-87. As much as I hate preemptive shots from a probability of kill standpoint, from a defense suppression standpoint, it is still a 13-foot long package of lethality in the air halfway to the target. You're going to throw your preemptive CBU in the air? No. So I'm not going to put that in the top 10 stupidest things I've ever heard anybody say, but it's probably a contender for 11.
What do you think then? So bearing in mind that what you've just said is self-evident and obvious to anybody who really thinks about it, what do you think the influence of this person's war and where they went to war and when they did it, which was March 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom, what influence do you think that has on their thinking? And I ask because I guess if you went to war in 1991 where there were lots of no-killing SA2, SA3 shots, and they were shooting people down. People were downed in 1991 by SA2s and SA3s. So there was this sort of long-range type capability versus my understanding of March 2003, where there were some Rolands, there might have been some SA6s, lots of sort of shorter range type stuff. Do you think that has an influence, or can you explain the thinking by the type of conflict that person had gone to and been involved in?
Yes, totally. Because one, the individual we're talking about flies F-16 CJs, or the F-16, and so the harm targeting system is not as good at targeting as the APR-47 was. The individual doesn't have the benefit of a Weasel school and that intense training. The individual doesn't operate with EWOs, so you don't have somebody who really knows the threat. And the threat density was relatively low, and they were pretty skittish. So if you put all that together and say, yeah, well, the harm's not that great. The harm, and these were Block 2 and 3 harms, killed 250 radars in Desert Storm. So there are opinions and there are facts. And the fact is that a properly targeted harm, in the real world, with an actual Weasel crew, killed a bunch of dudes.
Okay. Hopefully that will be the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a handy clown nose, I would just slap that right on to answer subsequent questions from this source, but I don't.
Okay, Ghost Dog has asked if you could have persuaded the top brass to keep the F4G in the Balkans and beyond, what upgrades would you say it needed to stay relevant? And at what point would you have seen the aircraft being retired?
Okay. So great question. We actually looked at this. I want a new radar. And really the radar we want is an APG-76 with an AMRAAM capability. So the APG-76 was one of the radars that went into Israeli Phantom upgrades. It's a U.S. radar. It's derived from a bunch of intruder radars. And it, aside from its air search modes, it actually did color 3-dimensional synthetic aperture.
Oh, nice.
And one of the things it did was it looked for rotators. So a rotating antenna is also a reflector. So as you're rotating it on a synthetic aperture radar, you get a star. You actually get a star, a crosshairs often. And you say, wow, there's a rotator. So why is that important? Because when a radar SAM has a rotating antenna, let's say a little mobile guy like an SA-8 or an SA-15, that's always rotating. It is not always transmitting. So when you are silent, the radar is transmitting in what we call a dummy load, where it's just essentially dumping its energy into the ground. But the antenna is still spinning. So if you have a SAR, a synthetic aperture radar, that can track a spinning antenna, you can find a guy who's sitting there and waiting who is not even transmitting. So radar would have been first. AMRAAM would have given us much better self-defense capability. So that was number one. No, hands down, no question about it. We discussed it for a while. The APG-76 was in play. The Air Force didn't want to spend the money, and they never wanted to spend money to upgrade the F-4 because it would have competed with the F-15. Can't have that. And this is we needed a new self-protection system of chaff and flares. So the ALE-40, we want to replace that with an ALE-47, and we probably want to carry more than we actually carried. So that was the next addition we identified. The jamming pods were pretty good. Towed decoys would have come along. If we'd stuck with the jamming pods, that would have been added in. As much as I love the J79, the next thing would have been a couple of different engines, mostly to get better fuel economy, but we might have done the conformal tank suggestion as well in order to get better range, so we needed more endurance. And lastly, what goes with the radar and so on is a heads-up display for the pilot, as the F4G didn't have one, and some additional glass displays instead of, no kidding, cathode ray tubes or digital upgrades of cathode ray tubes as our sensors. Those are the things we would have been big. There could have been some cleanup, right? A cockpit redesign for pilot vehicle interface would have been good. Eventually, we would have expected to get GPS, because you know how I use GPS in the F4G? I took a Garmin FlightMate, and I would hold it up near the top of the canopy to get 4 satellites, and I'd keep looking at it like this to see if I had 4 satellites, and I'd put my finger on the freeze button, and simultaneously I would freeze my position in the Garmin. I would hit the freeze button on the Arnie, and I would pull the coordinates from the Garmin. I would type them in to the RN101. I would hit enter. It would backtrack to the freeze point, and that's my GPS update. So GPS kind of would have been nice. But we didn't really need it necessarily for the harm. And there were other software tweaks to the APR-47 that we'd have done, but that could have happened without any actual upgrades. The guys that supported us, Court Smith and his crowd at Warner Robins Air Force Base, were so good with the software that it was just a question of man hours on what we could do with that. The full capacity of our sidekick computers, which were the thread processors, wasn't even fully utilized.
Really?
So we had computational room to do more things with the APR-47.
So from a hardware point of view, that system was good, was sort of future-proofed in a sense?
It wasn't future-proof, but again, we were using a computer that had actually expanded beyond the easy ability to program it, because we're now using 1980s computers with an Apollo programming language, derived from the Apollo program that is ridiculously efficient on the memory front. And so we actually had some room to do things. Eventually, you could have swapped it with data.
Which is a point, actually, if anyone's watching who hasn't gone and seen Starbaby's rear cockpit tour, because you talk about that, the verb noun entry methods in the back seat of the F4G into that system. I think
absolutely, where you would go, I'd go plus 77, which is the noun or the address, and then I'd put in plus 1, which is the verb, do this. And in that case, plus 77 plus 1 was the entries I had to make in order to tell the aircraft that I had a SIM plug loaded in the pylon rather than a real harm. So it would behave as if a harm was there. The other thing I didn't think of at the time, way back in the day, because I didn't know any better, but in retrospect, an upgrade, sheepskin seat covers.
Yeah, what was it Hacker said about those? He said you could fly a 9-hour mission, it would only feel like a 7-hour mission or something. Did you felt the same about those?
I felt pretty much the same about that, but I was, looking at the F-15 guys from an F-4 perspective, it's like they're weenies because they have sheepskin seat covers. And then 2 sorties into the F-15 transition, it's like, I am never giving up my sheepskin seat covers.
Okay, so Starbaby, who's your Starbaby? Someone's messaging you. I think this might still be Ghost Dog, but said you mentioned something close to the F-15E being closer to the Wild Weasel role, which reminded me that there was an earlier concept for the F-15 doing EW stuff and having ECM pods on station 1 and 9. Oh, that wasn't a question, that was a statement. Okay, there you go. Well, that's what happens.
Okay, However, this is actually, so that's a little different flavor. If you're going to put ECM pods. I've never heard of ECM pods on stations 1 and 9 of any variety, although it could have been done on a test bird. Certainly harms were put on stations 1 and 9 at Eglin. McDonnell Douglas has a plan today to put all of the electronics, including the LQ-99 pods, from the Growler onto a Strike Eagle. That's kind of another checkpoint of when the Air Force actually cares about electronic warfare. You'll know it because they'll at least think about that program.
Yeah. Okay, Gringo says, are you aware of, or do you believe the systems on the CJ have gotten better since the last time that you flew with them? So the 10 criteria, so you said previously in the video that the criteria are classified, but of the 10 criteria that you stated in the last video, do you think it now surpasses the F4G in more than just one of those?
Not even close. Surpasses? Absolutely no way. However, another one of the 10 criteria, it basically obtained equivalency.
Okay. So it's still miles behind.
Yeah, but that was technical equivalency and not practical equivalency because of, tiny little pod versus 52 antennas.
Yeah. And it's I guess it's sort of fairly obvious even to the uninformed like me to figure out what some of those criteria might be. So in terms of being able to triangulate and being able to geolocate where an emitter is, that kind of stuff. So I think we can probably imagine what sorts of things some of them at least might be.
Imagine away.
Imagine away. Now, scroll away. That's what I'm going to do. Exchequer says, serious question for you, Starbaby. Okay, we're back to this guy again. I think this is the last question, but this guy mentioned in his book that he had a bad experience with an EWO at Spang, had sort of smack talked him apparently and bruised his ego a little bit. And the question from Exchequer was that you?
I wish it had been. So it was not me, and I don't know who it was, but good on him. And I actually, General Jean-Marc Juas, who was a Weasel pilot, great dude, great pilot. He offered me the wing EWO job at Spang in my last year at Lakenheath in an attempt to save me from the prowler that was going to force me out of the regular Air Force. And I turned him down because I felt that going into an F-16 wing where he was shortly going to give up command was going to be a bad location to be for a promotion. And I would just put myself in a position where I was going to go do some excess misery and still not get promoted. So I went to the National Guard instead. But if I knew that that the pilot in question were at Spangdahlem, in retrospect, maybe I need to rethink that decision. Maybe there was somebody that I could have shared my misery with by inflicting it. I don't know. No, so it wasn't me. Sorry, dude.
Okay. Okay, Sedlo's asking, is there still a big Weasel mission to suppress or destroy AAA?
Interesting question. So I remember talking to one of the George Acree. George Acree was one of the Vietnam Weasel guys. And he told me once, he said, flak suppression missions were the dumbest thing he's ever done, and he would never do it again, and he would never urge anybody else to do it again. So in the case of radar-guided AAA, it's still worth a harm. A flap wheel can still direct some 57mm cannons, maybe even something bigger. But all the smaller stuff now is largely, it's both guns and SAMs, right? So you're kind of getting the guns. You don't throw in the black keys for free. You're kind of getting the guns for free. But it's still part of the mission. It's just that it's not the highest priority thing on the scope.
Would I be mistaken in thinking that AAA is also these days more of a point defense type weapon? I mean, back in World War II, they would be firing anti-aircraft artillery at the bombers streaming out from East Anglia off over France or Holland or wherever it was, almost all of the way to prevent them from getting to the target. But as part of the layered sort of IADs these days, is AAA now much more of a close-in type weapon?
It's much more like SHORADs, unless you go to North Korea, in which they have not thrown away all that stuff from the Second World War and the Korean War. And if you remember Bassa talking about flak over northern Iraq, he said that stuff was thick and it was high. And so there are portions of the world where it might still be a threat. But if you look at modern radar-guided stuff, you're down to 35 millimeters, 40 millimeters and below. And so that kind of necessitates the short-range SHORADs kind of thing.
And just as a final add-on question then to that, there's obviously the ongoing, it's perennial, isn't it, discussion about whether or not you go in low or whether or not you go in medium altitude. And I guess we'll see sort of the ups and downs of both arguments over the course of time. But does AAA, because of course those have an effective altitude, the smaller calibers in particular, but I guess they're more deadly low down anyway, does the type of attack make a difference to how you would prioritize what threats you were going to try and neutralize?
Absolutely. So the kind of attack that the strikers are executing is going to affect how I prioritize the threats, hands down. I need to suppress the threats that are going to be or that are a threat to the strikers. The problem with a AAA engagement is no harm is ever going to interrupt a AAA engagement. Somebody brings their radar up, gets a track, and starts hosing you down with 35 millimeters. There is nothing a defense suppression guy can do to help you out. You're all on your onboard ECM, your chaff, and your maneuvers. I may help out the next guy, but you're on your own, dude.
Yeah. Okay, Bear asks, he's got a question about beam rider weapons like the Ataka or Vikhr. I don't know if this is Wild Weasel related, actually. I don't know. Do you want to answer?
I don't know what a Vikhr is.
Vikhr is an anti-tank weapon used by KA-50, Mi-28s, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I don't know if it's optically sighted. I don't know, wire-guided maybe. I'm not sure. It spins when it flies off. Anyway, let's answer the question. It's not Wild Weasel related. I should have got it out. But anyway, are they any good against maneuvering platforms?
Probably not. Wire guide, it depends on maneuvering platforms, right? So if you're slow speed platform, we've seen the Ukrainians use missiles against hovering helicopters and patrol boats. They work. Once you probably get past the 30 knot range, you're going to be hard pressed to do it. And certainly from a maneuvering aircraft, that's so deep in the no way, you're kind of wasting your time.
Okay. There we go. Let that one slide then. All right. So Mako NL says, so this isn't really Wild Weasel related either, but maybe you want to answer it. What are your thoughts, or what are the thoughts of military aviators on us sim pilots? And is it weird there's a massive community of people who want to know what you do for a day job?
So I'm not going to speak for the rest of the community in any way. We know we're cool, right? That's just the way it is. And we, as a block, your average aviator is an aviation enthusiast. They may or may not play flight simulator games or something like that, but they think airplanes are cool. And so people who are into airplanes, we're not going to look down on those people. We may tell stories about them. The plane spotters coming up to me at an air show and looking at the tail number and saying, this British air show, I might add, looks at my tail number and says, hey, this airplane was in Lukers during the first 2 weeks of August last year, wasn't it? And I looked at him and said, I don't know. And he looked at me like I was a freaking moron. It's not even my jet. So, I'm going to make fun of that guy, but his hobby's still kind of cool. He's just a little anal about it. So where it gets weird is, and everybody sees this, is when the simulator or the analysis crowd, guys with no actual experience, tells us that we suck or that we're not doing it right or, they did something and therefore, they're better at this than we are. and then you get the appropriate level of amused disdain that you're never going to recover from. But everybody has that, right? Everybody has the person who does the internet search and thinks they're an instant doctor. Every profession has the example of the guy, well, maybe not accountants and real estate agents, but, the guy that did it in a simulator and thinks, oh, hey, I can do this better than you. And it's just the way it goes. So what do we think of the sim community? You have at least a fun hobby.
I love the idea of there being an accountancy simulator.
I mean, that would be crazy. Or, real estate simulator. I mean, you can simulate driving trucks on ice. You can simulate driving maritime rescue ships, and getting close enough to launch your small boat. You can do all that. An accountancy simulator, just, do an Excel tutorial, and you're right there, man. And it's probably free.
So he had a follow-on question, which is actually fairly interesting. It's at what point is an accurate simulation potentially going to go too far and help a potential adversary in getting information about Western systems, let's say, because they tend to be Western things that are simulated. I mean, notwithstanding the export controls that are on certain documents and the fact that those are not always respected, it's the Western countries who tend to be fairly free with a lot of the technical information around, at an unclassified level. They tend to be fairly free. In the East, it seems everything is protected and everything is sacrosanct. So at what point do you think then a sim would go too far in helping, some Russian or some Chinese dude figure out what a capability might be or how to counter a particular MDS?
Well, if the Russians occupied St. Louis and got a hold of the Boeing Dome simulators, that would be pretty darn helpful technically. Your commercial sims, they're not going to get to that point for two reasons. One, everybody that's programming those is just doing their best guess. And two, they're not necessarily being flown by professionals who know the systems.
Okay, short and sweet. Right, Voodoo has asked, I read that F4G squadrons were mixed with F4Es. I'd like to know how the F4E was used alongside the F4G. It's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, but there we go. Start with that. He's got a couple of follow-ons, but start with that.
Right, so a mixed squadron. In this case, the F4E would carry a pair of Shrikes. And the Shrikes were AGM-45s, Vietnam era, where in order to get the frequency band you want, you had to change out the seeker. And what we would do with an F4E is you'd put them on the wing, okay, in a little closer than your normal tactical formation, and you would match a heading, and you would call hip shot with a heading. The guy turns to that heading, he jacks his nose, and he pickles off a Shrike. That's it, man. That's what you've got. Okay. Now, in the F4G, I actually had a Wes. It was a couple of staples with a cross in it. Okay, that would tell me where I was in the Shrike Wes. So chances are the two are pulling it side by side. But if I tell an F4E to hip shot, or an F4G with a degraded system, because we practice that too. If I tell somebody to hip shot, I already know that when he jacks the nose up, it's going to be on the envelope. All he has to do is match the heading and press the pickle button. It's that simple. And then you had another Phantom with a couple of AIM 7s, potentially some heaters, depending on how you loaded it out. And that's how you did it. The ALIC, the aircraft launch interface computer that put the harm on the F-16, was designed for the F4 pair. It was designed for the F4E. It's just that the F4E went out of service before the ALIC was fielded at numbers. And the integrated data modem for exchange of information between airplanes was designed for F4G, F4E pairs, not the F-16. But again, it took so long to get what was really a good idea into service that it necessarily went into a newer airplane.
I think you and I are going to do it. It sounds weird to say we're going to do it, but we're going to do an F4G episode, aren't we? We've talked about so many different things, but I think there was talk about us doing something together around your time flying the F4G, because we've never really discussed that. So I've got some questions about F4G that maybe I will hold until that interview.
Well, hold until then. because that's, I mean, we've only done snapshots like supersonic sausage patty laydowns or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll hold my questions until then. We'll let the audience get theirs in. So he's got a follow-on question, which was, so you've just described how the hunter-killer mission worked, I think, so that's answered that. But he said, was it only the F4E that had the the ARN 101 DMAS?
No. The G models had it, and you really had to have it as part of the APR 47. There were APR 38. Can you explain what it was? Pardon?
Can you explain what it was? What is the ARN?
Oh, so the DMAS, the ARN 101, ARNI. It's this ring laser gyro inertial navigation system with a keypad and digital interface that talks to the APR 47. That's how the APR 47 did all its positional work. It was all tied to the ARNI. And so in order to do its work right, it had to have a good functional inertial navigation system. And it's amazing that it was functional with the steam-driven LN-12. But the LN-12 usually knew where it was. It just didn't necessarily know where anything else was because it only had 2 waypoints, the point you're at and the point you want to go to. And that's all it's got. But it's still tracking your position. So ARNI allowed you to type in 99 waypoints, to do certain things with special lists that we're not going to talk about. It gave you a display option. It really completely expanded the capability. So all of the Gs had it because in order to have the APR 47, which is an upgrade of the APR 38, you had to have an ARNI. And one other thing I did leave out about the F4G, F4E mixed is you could easily load up an F4E with general purpose bombs or COF CBU and have them off the wing too. You can do the same with F-16. I flew plenty of missions over northern Iraq where the F-16 was not carrying arms because why would it when I had them? But it was carrying 4 cans of CBU.
I don't know if it's coming up, but really quickly then. No, I'm going to save it. I wanted to ask you about Maverick. I should write this down really because I'll just forget it. I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to let the audience get their questions in, but I wanted to ask you about Maverick, and if that comes up, it comes up. If it doesn't, it'll be on the next episode. So
we'll do it in the next episode because then I'll bring in video.
Okay, sweet. All right. Okay, Gorio has asked, I've heard stories of G-model guys saying magnum on the radio to trick the Iraqis into thinking they launched a harm. How prevalent was this in Weasel units, and do you know if the Navy or Marines ever did anything similar?
I do not know if the Navy or the Marines did it, but I'd be surprised if they did not. Yes, you would make a fake magnum call. Obviously, you're not on Havquick, you're not secure, and that could happen when you're out of harms. And that could happen even if you've still got a harm left. The problem with saying magnum like that on the radio is you're not only potentially deceiving the enemy, and that's kind of a long... In order to deceive the enemy, they have to be listening to your frequency and able to communicate to the guy on the ground. So that's a bit of a stretch. You're deceiving all of the guys on strike primary who just think you've put a harm in the air when you haven't.
I suppose they would find out soon enough, wouldn't they?
Yeah, maybe too soon.
Okay. Nux has said, this is another question stemming from DCS for those of us that enjoy building missions and mission planning. In real life discussions, I see more dedicated seed elements in a package. Or ad hoc seed using traditional weapons like in your F-15E videos. Is it realistic for strikers to dedicate one pylon to having a harm just in case there's a pop-up threat? So I'm guessing he's asking about sort of those platforms like the F-16, F-18 that are not necessarily dedicated Weasel platforms but can carry harm. So that you wouldn't carry one of those as in self-protection mode.
Nope. You would not. You'll see a test bird do it, but that's a different, requirement. That's not a mission thing. You're either doing seed or you're not. However, having said that, when the sidearm was in service, the AGM-144, this was a Sidewinder C, a radar-guided Sidewinder that was converted into an anti-radiation missile. But because it's a small diameter, that means small antenna, which means high frequencies only. So it was going against Soviet high-frequency Juliet band radars. And those are naturally short-range stuff. And so those could be carried in place of a Sidewinder, and the way they were designed to be used was you turn them on, and you just go do your mission. And if it detected a signal, it was going to launch itself.
Really?
Yeah, so I've only heard anecdotally that pilots did not dig that mode and did not use it. And so you're kind of without a targeting system to give you a good clue other than the missile seeker itself. So, you could bring a sidearm along because it's just a name 9 form factor, but that's long out of the inventory. So you are not bringing a harm along just because.
Okay. So Mogami has asked, we've got a hypothetical scenario here. Starbaby is promoted to Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and gets an order from politicians to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine. How do you go about it? This is also not Weasel related, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not really Weasel related, but it is kind of air campaign related. You don't go about it half-assed, and you don't announce it in advance. You surprise it, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to clear out every adversary radar or SAM that you think you can locate. And so what you're basically doing is you're starting an air campaign against Russia, period, dot. The U.S. is entering the war against Russia, and you're going to do what is normally a standard early day move for any air campaign is you're going to wipe out the air defenses that can affect your mission. And that's what you're going to do.
He's got some other sort of follow-on questions, but which I won't go through because there are quite a few questions still to go. But he does ask, his favorite sub-question, I guess, is how would you task the F-35 on those first days of the war?
There are threat systems that I would expect the F-35 to be very effective in, and I'd use the F-35 pretty heavily as part of my opening punch. But I want them to deliver some kind of standoff, and I want them to do it in an unexpected way. So I might bring F-35s, I need to suppress defenses in Crimea, and I might bring them in over the Black Sea. At the same time, other stuff is coming in from elsewhere. I'd have to see a threat lay down before I could plan it, but I would use their RF low observability in combination with some degree of standoff to the maximum extent possible. And that might be small diameter bombs, in which case I definitely want to come in from the backside. Because the radars, the modern, phased array, planar arrays, they're only looking one direction. And if anybody could sneak around behind them and throw a short knife into the kidneys, that would be what I'd use the F-35 for. Keeping in mind that they're not going to carry a whole lot of ammunition, and they're not going to do a really long-range hook. Use them for what they're designed to do.
They could strafe afterwards.
Yeah, they could get right on that. One burst. Although there is a condition where I regret that Ugly and I did not turn back around and do a high-angle strafe on a SAM. It was mostly because we'd not trained to do high-angle strafe. Strike Eagles didn't strafe at the time frame. I mean, did not strafe.
That didn't stop the Seamole guys from strafing in Desert Storm.
Did they hit anything?
I think they did. I think they hit some parked aircraft. That's what they were doing. They were trolling. The Iraqi Air Force at that point was fleeing to Iran, and there might be take on the day to go and chase down a couple of Mirage F1s or whatever, and they got bored patrolling H3 and Odysseus and all these different airfields, and saw some stuff on the ground, decided they'd strafe it. I think they hit them. They got grounded for it. But anyway,
also exactly what should have happened.
Not that I was trying to cast any shade on you and Ugg, but it just came to mind. Story. Anyway, okay. Pyro, our resident F111 driver, says, what were your most task saturating cockpit tasks in two situations, if it's possible to separate. The first is the most challenging information gathering task. Let's just leave it at that. What was the most task saturating, challenging information gathering task that you had?
Working the radar, hands down. If you were working the radar, it was tough, much tougher to actually manage the radar warning gear, radar homing and warning, so the APR-47. So if you're working the radar, you're in an air-to-air fight, and I could use the APR-47 effectively as a situational awareness tool in that process, to the point where, I can even listen to signals and try and identify what the adversary air intercept radar is doing. I could still integrate all that, and that's where it gets toughest. At that point, I probably lost the ability to keep up the visual search. I have no idea where the wingman is. I'm probably not prosecuting a SAM. I've got to do one of the others. So there were EWOs like Chuck Patio or Kobe. They could manage the radar and still keep up a visual search and all that. They were older and had more time in the aircraft. I still don't know if I'd have ever gotten to that point. So at that point, running the radar air-to-air is going to suck you into doing air-to-air things. And that was definitely the most challenging.
Okay, and the second scenario he wants to know about is the most challenging F4G weapon to get on target or off the rail because of complex switchology or ROE limits.
Oh, well, those are two entirely different things. So I think the highest complexity to get a missile off the rail in its envelope was probably the Shrike, the AGM-45, because you have to be pointed at the target. There's not much turn. There's a limited staple. You had to loft it, and you had to know what seeker you had on, and you had to know what the threat, whether it was going to be in that band. So the Shrike was pretty complex and not very favored. Otherwise, the switchology itself was not bad. I mean, it's select the station, have the master arm in arm, hit the pickle button for most of the weapons.
Really?
The harm being an exception, and the harm that you actually had to hand off. So before you launch a harm, the EWO hits the handoff button, and that handoff word's only valid for 7 seconds. You don't get the harm off in 7 seconds, the word expires. So one of the reasons why the backseater would normally pickle the button and launch the harm from the back is because it has all the information. So I want a handoff, I want to see a ready light, I might want to see an ACK light, and then I hammer down. And those are tools that the pilots did not have available to run through the whole sequence. So that's where it's not so much switchology as it is indications.
What about ROE then? Obviously, ROE are generally sensitive, so maybe you can only talk in generalities, but were there particular ROE that were more problematic than others around being able to engage a threat system?
So you often, in the no-fly zones, the ROE wasn't normally going to let you target a acquisition radar like a Barlock. But if it was a threat radar, that pretty much crosses the hostile intent line. And once you cross the hostile intent line, it's hammered down. That's one thing that made that aspect of ROE easy to fill, is if a guy brings up a threat radar, it's hostile intent. There's no question about it. And there's no real question with a good EWO of misidentifying your signal either. And so all those trips happen right away. Pretty much by the time that the 6 shows up on your scope, ROE requirements have been met.
Okay, Gorio asks, what's the best example of teamwork that you've seen during a Weasel mission? And similarly, what's the worst example of, I guess, non-teamwork, or best example of non-teamwork?
So the best example of teamwork that I can think of personally was flying with Dennis Malver. Malv, another great pilot, one of my favorites, and I remember being over northern Iraq in the no-fly zone, and we are cruising along, and all of a sudden at our right 4 o'clock, we get the symbol is an I with track bars. So I means it's an India band unknown, and India band is where, 8 to 10 megahertz where a whole lot of threat lives. And the track bar means that it's on us. That was one great thing about the F4G, is it had the ability to reliably, although not perfectly, but reliably distinguish if you were being tracked by a radar. So I've got an eye with track bars, and I say, and mouth goes, I got it. And we're in a slicing 4G turn to put the nose on, because he knows what's happening next, and I know what's happening next. And what's happening next is the nose is coming on. I'm handing off the India band because I've already decided it's, I've looked at the frequency and PRF and decided it's potentially a threat radar and a harm's coming off the rail. That's it, man. I got it. And as we enter a turn, so look at it from the Iraqis' point of view, is I've suddenly just locked up an airplane. It suddenly goes into a hard right turn. The dude shut down and we never saw him again. And I've mentioned this before. I mean, I never saw a signal with that parameter in northern Iraq again. I don't know what it was, but the unknown India band track bars was enough for us to want to kill it. The worst example of crew coordination I've ever seen is a pilot that I'm not going to name and a story that I'm only going to tell in the F4G. But it's another, it happened to me. It's one of those guys you flew with who was A, bad at his job, B, a complete dick, and C, a lying sack of poo when it came to this particular sortie. So anyway, that's a later story.
That to look forward to. Okay. So Robbie Jackson, who's our resident Hornet driver, Super Hornet driver, says, any good LPA stories, or whatever the correct term is for AF JOPA?
LPA, Lieutenants Protective Association, right. Shoot. No. Only because you'll get them in an F4G when I was actually a lieutenant. But you'll hear about, there's a Snacko story or two, and there's a call sign story or two, and there's a being scared by the low fuel light story or two, and all lieutenant stories, some of them LPA stories. All right, I'm going to tell one of my favorites. We were in Dhahran right after the Gulf War, and to blow off steam, you would go to Bahrain, because in Bahrain they had alcohol. Now, I don't drink, so that's no big deal, but it's totally, when you get out of Saudi Arabia, you can feel the sense of oppression lift. And it's not like Bahrain is a non-oppressive regime. It's just not as repressive as the Saudis are. I mean, they're kind of hard to beat. And you can feel things just lighten up. And so we'd gone out to a beach club. We had a beach. There was alcohol. The guys are wasted. We're all in a bus. And we're going to go, and the driver is late to bring us back into Saudi Arabia. And so Siggy, Steve Heil, call sign Sig, Heil, obviously, was our detachment commander. He's in the row in front of me. He's blasted. And it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm a morning person. I'm not a night person. And he goes, Starbaby, get up there and drive us home. I go, fuck you, Ziggy. And he just gives this harumphing noise like he's an old drunk lieutenant colonel, and there's no further commentary. Until the guy from the seat behind me kind of peeks his nose over. This is an Army, like, private first class. And he goes, isn't that your commanding officer? I go, yes, it is. He goes, boy, the Air Force sure is different. There we go. One quick lieutenant story.
And we've got some stories about you coming up. So Spike, who's a mate of yours, you flew F4Gs with, he's going to come on
Absolutely,
the channel.
2 squadrons.
And I'm going to be playing him for stories about you. They are to look forward to as well.
Well, 1, they're all lies. And 2, I was in 2 squadrons with Spike and deployed on him on multiple occasions. So at least he has a good vantage point from which to make up his lies.
Okay, let's move on. So Bishop says, if we're interested in electronic warfare, GBAD, and so on in performing in the real, how it performs in the real world, but we only have access to OSINT, what, if anything, would we be looking for, if it's possible for you to say?
You'd look for books written by or about guys that actually did it, unless they did it in the F-16, in which case you'd skip those over. the other place you look for good data that is well researched is you'd go to the Air Power Australia website. Now, it is aging because there was a law passed by the Aussies that really criminalized any kind of defense information. So it had the unfortunate effect of putting a chilling effect on Australian, on OSINT websites. Because despite the fact that the Australian government is not obligated to protect Russian or Chinese secrets, the law was written so broadly that guys didn't want to take the risk. But nevertheless, the Air Power Australia website is going to be your best reference on ground-based air defense from an unclassified standpoint, hands down. The guys are really good, and they're engineers, and they're not dealing with secret data. They are dealing with what they can look at, what they can translate, what they can read from airshow magazines. That's the place to go.
Was that Carlo Kopf or someone?
It was Dr. Kopf,
okay.
you bet.
Dr. Kopf. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I wondered why he'd gone quiet for the last 20 years. Or whatever it is. It feels...
Yeah, it's only been a couple of years. It's been a huge loss because there's a lot of updates I'd like to see.
What about... So I was going to say, so Tony Thornborough is a friend of yours. He's written a bunch of good books on Wild Weasel. Iron Hand I know he did a book on.
He wrote Iron Hand. And in fact, the picture behind me, I turn around because I'm a dumbass. This is virtual. The picture behind me is what's on the back cover of that particular book. Tony Thornborough, Iron Hand.
Yeah. Is it a good book? You recommend
I
it?
liked it. I mean, it's got me in it. So by definition, it's a good book, at least partially.
Okay. All right. So Crepe has asked, do you think the B1 and the B2 and the F-117 were worth their investments?
Oh, the F-117, absolutely worth their investments. It's not the 117's fault or the fault of that program that the Air Force took off on an all stealth all the time at all costs mode. The 117 was marvelous, and it was stealthy. No radar, no radio transmissions, no afterburner, engine cooling or exhaust cooling methodologies, black color, no antennas, for radar warning gear, quiet. I mean, that was it. The B2, technologically, the B2 is actually pretty neat. And what you can say about the B2 is that it would have led to it did lead to the B-21. And I think it showed some of the advantages of big airframe stealth. It's weird, but because of the physics of scattering and resonance, that it is sometimes easier to make a big object radar low observable than it is a small object. So big aircraft low observability is a bit different from small aircraft low observability because of the size of the features. So the B2 was really useful in Serbia, aside from the whole Chinese embassy thing. But that may actually have been really useful because Dr. Hosmer at RAND, when he wrote his book on Allied Force, which is called something terrible like Why Milosevic Decided to Capitulate When He Did. It's like the most inelegant title ever. But nevertheless, he pointed out that the Serbs did not necessarily believe the strikes on the Chinese embassy were accidental. And so it may have figured into their calculus on terminating the war on NATO terms. So, yes, by that standard, combat employment, which is a great standard to judge an airplane by, the B2 is totally worth it.
There was a question. So I have to be careful about how I talk about sequences because we're recording this in the middle of January and this will probably be going out at the end of February. And the the Balkans episodes we recorded that are being released now, we recorded in late November, early December. So I had to get my sequencing right. So in the last episode that I have just released, which is episode 3 of the Balkans conflict in the Strike Eagle, you talked about angst between you and the stealth guys around the secret ATO, the US only ATO rather. Was the B2 component part of that? It sounded like the 117 guys were sort of freezing you out. Was it the same with the B2?
Yeah, the B-2 was on the air tasking order, but this wasn't an air tasking order issue. My beef with the 117 guys is that they wouldn't coordinate with us. They wouldn't tell our plan, and they expected us to plan around them. And I can do that once, but when they change the plan, then don't tell us, and then when they finally do tell us we have to plan again, that's where they got the big salute. And, you know, a long-standing grievance. Plus the stealth guy telling me that they were going to take out the Serbian IOCs when in reality nobody knew where the interceptor operations centers were. So prima donna, I mean, I'm a prima donna and we don't get along with other prima donnas well because that whole prima thing. And just having a guy BS me on the IOC, you know, the community doesn't recover from that. Even though the guy that did that was in 06, he might have the guys in the 117 community might have hated him too. You know, so we could join together, but by and large, that's limited to a small subset of F-117 guys that I never got to meet in person. You know, otherwise, F-117 guys love them, man.
Okay, so Bear, this is still not Wild Weasel related. We seem to have, on our Wild Weasel AMA, gone off track a little bit, but we'll ask the question anyway. Bear has asked whether or not the big investment in the F-35 has been worth it.
Absolutely not. Okay, it would have been worth it if the contractor had performed, if the aircraft were anywhere near on time, and if it weren't just riddled with deficiencies. And that's all I'm going to say on that because it's just a rant. If you want me to rant about the F-35, go to Discord and save all the listeners, you know, ears on that.
Okay. All right. So he's got a follow-on question. I'm not sure if he's talking about the F-35, but he's asking, would it be a fair assumption that this new aircraft, even if not the best, has spearheaded a new way? This doesn't make sense to me. I'm just going to move on. Let me do this. I'm doing it slowly because last time I did this, I did it so quickly I missed it, and then I put in the video of my son coming in, interrupting us, and then that snowballed, and that was a fucking nightmare. Oh, it pissed me off too. Right, anyway.
You know you're going to leave that in. Oh, carry on.
All right, okay. Here we go. Foy has a question. Hey there, I've got a question involving the harm. In old HUD footage, I noticed magnum callouts are suffixed with golf and tango, like magnum 6 golf. I'm just curious to know what this suffix or letter or word means.
Yeah, it means something.
Okay. Mad Max is saying, or asking, at the end of the F4G's service life, SAMs that are capable of point defense, i.e. intercepting harms, were entering service. Did the Weasels train to defeat those threats, or was that left up to the brand new CJs and Prowlers?
No, and of course it wasn't left up to them because they can't do any better. The response, and we're seeing it in Ukraine, to the like the SA-15, the Russians advertised they could intercept harms. Whether or not those advertisements are valid, I'm not prepared to comment on. But the approach to harm shooters when faced with those kind of SAM systems has been, yeah, give it your best shot.
Do you think that accounts for why the Ukrainians are ripple firing them? You mentioned earlier one of the differences between a slap shot, let's say, when you were flying out in Iraq in Northern Watch or Southern Watch, whichever it was, I can't remember, and the Ukrainians is that you would fire one, they would fire two.
Yeah, so now that we know that the MiG doesn't actually have to fire both of them, and since I've seen more footage and more smoke trails, I think I have an idea on why they're doing that, and I think I'm not going to discuss it at all.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So, Jax the Raptor Dude, who's our chief meme officer, hey Jax, he said, reading again about the famous, I think it might be infamous, strike package Q, public data states that one of the F-16's problems was there weren't enough seed operators available to clean the path for them. due to the F4's fuel problem. So he's talking about this fairly well-known big strike package that went to hit something in Iraq. I can't remember what it was. Starbaby, you'll tell us. And it wasn't very successful. It was kind of an experiment of sorts, I think. Anyway, so he's saying the F4 had a fuel problem, which meant they couldn't protect the strikers through providing seed. Do you have any insight into the mission and what they could have done differently? That's his question.
Yeah, so what they could have done differently is not taken a bunch of guys downtown into Baghdad at the limit of their range. That was the fundamental problem for everybody. It's a fundamental problem for the Vipers. They were going in on a target with, I might add, non-precision weapons. Not so much the EF-111 because they had the gas, but also the F-4G because even with 3 tanks, which is how we normally flew over Iraq. Remember, I missed the Gulf War, so I have to read about this same as everybody else. Everybody's at the limit of their range, and when you're at a limit on the range, you've only got a couple minutes on station. And when you only have a couple minutes on station, the timing becomes critical. It has to be perfect for everybody, and it was not perfect for everybody. So the solution to that problem is not on the executors. It's on the guys that built the air tasking order don't do stupid stuff. You were pushing your luck. You weren't going to get a significant military effect. This is not like you had to get a nuclear missile before it was shot off. This was not a combat search and rescue operation. These were a bunch of non-moving targets that weren't going anywhere and were not really critical to the war effort. And you put together, a high-risk strike package at the end of everybody's range. So how do you avoid that? You don't do stupid stuff.
Do you remember what they were hitting then? I mean, because in 91, that's all the F-16s had was, low drag general purpose type stuff, wasn't it? But
I don't remember what they were hitting. It was just in the southern half of Baghdad is what I remember about it.
Okay.
But whatever it wasn't a time-sensitive target. And it was something that could have been hit by something else or they should have waited on. You just can't push your luck by that. If you have a tactical plan, or if you have set up a bunch of tactical conditions in which everything has to go right and the timing has to be perfect, you have screwed the pooch because everything does not always go right and the timing is never perfect.
So Mad Max has a question which touches on something you were talking about earlier. So he says that you briefly mentioned using the APR-47 to find air targets during training because of the lackluster power of the F-4G's radar. Was this an official thing or just something that you picked up from your time in the back of the jet?
Oh, no. Everybody did it. Some guys did it better than others. It was taught in the Weasel School. It had obviously been done for some time because the later software tapes were used a little of repurposing of the information displayed to the EWO so that you could get better situational awareness on air targets. So it was definitely a built-in capability. And it wasn't that the T-model's radar didn't have power. It's a pulsed radar. And pulsed radar means anytime you're looking down, you've got a bunch of ground clutter in it. And I actually have, and we'll talk about it during the F4G, I have found and digitized my final flight in the F4G, which was an air combat maneuvering flight, I think a 2v1. And I've got it. And all it's a tape of is the radar and the voices.
Really?
So we can see, yes. And so you guys will get the clue in an F4G episode of exactly what that radar looked like. And we can roll through that and everything. It'll be fun.
Fantastic. That's very cool. Very cool. All right. So his sort of sub question, which I think you kind of already answered, was whether or not it was officially supporting the aeroplane via software or rather than you having to mentally form a picture.
Both.
Okay. Is that something you'll expand on or you're not able to? Or you'll wait for the F4G?
Oh, I'm not going to talk all I'm not going to talk about is the degree of precision. But this is something, we can talk about in the F4G. I mean, what I can say is that the point out that the APR-47 gave us was most important in elevation. And the system was more accurate in elevation than the beam width of the F4's radar.
Really?
Okay, so that meant that you had literally degrees of slop around what that thing, if you matched that, your elevation cursor with what the APR-47 was telling you, dude was in the radar beam. You still might not see him, but the dude was in your radar beam.
Wow. Yeah, because you guys had a very narrow radar beam, didn't you? I think the APQ-120, or I think was that
APQ-120.
Quite a narrow radar beam by today's standards, I think.
It's no narrower than anybody else's pre-AESA, right? A 3-degree you could look at any fighter and say, it's probably around 3 degrees, and you're going to be close.
Okay. All right, Red Flanker 333. Starbaby, greetings. Would it be possible for you to comment or provide your opinion on the friendly fire incidents during Iraqi freedom in 2003 when Patriot batteries shot down a Navy F-18 and an RAF Tornado GR-4, and the Air Force F-16 pilot who launched a harm at the Patriot battery? If I remember correctly, this was a threat reaction type thing. He just did it in defense of himself. He'd been targeted, I think, by a Patriot. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on the whole thing?
So, is buffoonery in all directions. The solution to a friendly fire is never to shoot back. So we're going to leave that at that. Although I have my doubts that that incident ever occurred as is described in open sources. So I don't want to blame the F-16 community because I'm not sure the incident happened as described or at all. We know that the Patriot fired on targets, on air-breathing targets, and we know that the Patriot has never shot down a hostile air-breathing target, only friendly ones. That's an Army system run by Army Air Defense, and that is both a system and a procedural failure. And so, people make mistakes, system can lead you down the wrong way, it's inexcusable. And the Army adjusted both their training and their software protocols after that. But that's genuine buffoonery.
Am I correct in remembering that these systems were automatic then? So if they had a contact, they queried it with the IFF and it either didn't respond or it responded with the wrong, because I'm guessing it was encrypted, I'm guessing it was mode 4, that the system, rather than wait for somebody to press a button to shoot a missile off, it would be able to fire itself. Is that your recollection? Is that what happened? It just automatically did it?
My recollection is that those were automatic system responses.
Okay. All right. Jack's asking, what's your most frightening moment in the F4 or F-15 in combat operations, if you had any? Not combat operations, but frightening moments in combat.
The most frightening moment, really, as I look back on it, was I talked about our Kevin Dungy and I setting a world record on the number of cables and barriers taken in a single pass. And I can't remember the tail number on that jet, but it wasn't the first time that jet tried to kill the two of us. Because a couple days before, we had been over southern Iraq on a Southern Watch mission, and the wing tanks had decided that they weren't going to feed. So now we don't, the way the fuel system works on the F4, eventually we got fuel gauges in the back seat. But his tape over counter doesn't account for all your fuel. You have to do some mental math, doesn't count for your external tapes. So by the time, there's no easy indication that tells you that your wing tanks are not feeding until you see the totalizer get to the point where you should have fed the wing tanks and it's not. And that has to be a big enough discrepancy for you to notice it. So by the time we notice that the wing tanks are not feeding, Kevin cycles all the switches and they're still not feeding. We don't have enough gas to make another friendly base. And so we can make it across the border into Saudi Arabia or Kuwait and then flame out. So at least we're ejecting over friendly territory. That's the situation we're in. A tanker, gotta love tanker guys, man. A tanker comes into Iraq to get us and tops us off and continues to pump fuel in because we're now an 8,000-pound internal fuel airplane. It's like being a Viper, and we know they don't have any gas. And only we have 2 engines, so our fuel flow is significantly higher. And kept us topped off till we got enough fuel that we were confident that we could make a base. Actually, we were able to go all the way home. We didn't have to divert into King Khalid Military City. But the thing with fuel problems is a lot of things that happen in a combat situation are fast. They're acute. They happen very quickly. You're busy reacting. Fuel is slow. It means you've got plenty of time to think exactly how screwed you are because you're trying to work on a mitigation plan. So, hands down, fuel failure to feed over Iraq on a combat mission, that's it. Everything else is startling. This is like, oh yeah, this is bad.
Did you jet the wing tanks?
No, because the drag reduction from jettison, and we figured this out early, wasn't going to do anything for us. We were not on the margins. We were done. It was, you're not making it. It's not, oh, maybe we can make it if we, we fly a fuel-conserving profile, we jettison all our external stuff. It's like, no, you're done.
Okay. Another question from Exchequer. So, we know that you're a phantom fluffer, but I'm really curious to know how it felt when you went and mastered the APG-70. Seems like a really cool bit of kit. I think you kind of answered this in the thing, which is one of the reasons it went from 2,000 words to 6,000 to get you guys to stop fucking talking.
Yeah, it was...
Keep it questions only, but go.
It was amazing. And, I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours in the part task simulator when I got to the part task trainer, when I got to Seymour, just extra time on the radar because it was so amazing. And I wanted to learn every function there was. There was a time period actually where the part task trainer, even from the back seat, you could do the auto acquisition modes because that almost made it into Suite 2. It made it into the flight test version of Suite 2, but not the fielded version of Suite 2. Because, honestly, there's no real reason for me to be using the auto acquisition modes in the back seat. And what's the pilot going to do? The pilot's going to say, hey, give me super search up. He can go bang, bang, super search up. He will accomplish that, or she will accomplish that in less time than it says to take, hey, give. So, anyway, but I practiced with those. The APG-70 is a pulse Doppler radar. It has an automatic raster search, so it's just going back and forth, over, down, over, down, over, down, over, down to get the search volume. It tells you what the search volume at range is. You're not trying to figure out the 60-to-1 rule. The F4's radar, you had a knob you could turn to give you whatever you wanted. You could have aspect, or you could have closure rate, or you could have aircraft heading, but you still had to do all the mental math to put those together. So most of it just left it in closure rate. Because if the guy's closing, if the closure rate is 1,000, you better deal with something pretty quickly, and he's coming right down the snot locker. If it's not 1,000, then he's not coming straight at you. You have more time, and he's not coming straight at you. Figure it out from the drift. You didn't have to do drift analysis. You could lock it up. It gave you a little star with this little stick telling you which way to go. You had AMRAM. You had high data rate track while scan. I cannot say enough about the air-to-air modes in the APG-70. It was just one long period of, acute infatuation with a new piece of kit. That's how it was. It's still that now. I love the APG-70. And, I've only flown the APG-82, the new AESA in simulation. And, man, I love that. But because it's not as big a step up, I don't love it as much as I did the APG-70 in 1996.
That's really interesting that you say it's not as big a step up. I guess to those of us who have not, don't have any privileged access to that kind of thing, or really much knowledge about it, we think of it as this sort of magic. And I hear people describe AESA as magic, and I know it's just a term of deference rather than meaning it. But I would have thought that based on what I've heard about AESA and its ability to run air-to-ground and air-to-air at the same time, fantastic long-range search capability, ability to pick out small RCS targets, multi-target track and scan at the same time, I would have thought that would be a similar quantum leap.
It's not that quantum leap, because what you're doing is more of the same thing. That's what AESA is getting you, is it's getting you more of the same. It is not the leap of allowing you to do things and see things that you could never have done or seen with the old radar. That's why I say I don't love it as much. It doesn't mean it's not spectacular.
No, it's fair enough. It's interesting to hear you not talk about air-to-ground mode. Then the SAR, the patch mapping ability, high-resolution mapping capability of the radar, was that less exciting to you?
No, it was more exciting, but that's not related to the F4G radar, right? So it's something I couldn't really do at all in the F4G, and I suddenly got a capability. And the air-to-ground map mode was amazing. It was great for navigation. I used it for targeting. You can get good information off it. Yeah, but since I could do none of that in the F4G, and the targets the targets in the F4G that I was working against, the F4G was way better at finding them than the F15 was, obviously. And so it's not the same apples to apples as air-to-air targets.
Fair enough. Okay. Bishop's asking, would you rather conduct seed in an F4G armed with only a fencing foil or an F-16 CJ with HTS and harm?
It depends. It would depend on the threat, and whether or not I could reasonably expect the F-16 to detect and hit the target. Whereas if I stick the fencing foil out of the bottom of the F4 on the centerline pylon, I know that I can, because I have in training, successfully, precisely locate and overfly a SAM. So, but I'd want to do it with two of us. So I had another dude to distract him while we got in from behind.
Okay. Mako NL. So do you think that other services or even other Air Force pilots and crew members truly understand the role you played and how vital you were? God, did you write that? Are you Mako NL?
No, I'm not. They don't now, because there's no means for them to learn it. In fact, I would say that the Air Force writ large has no idea what the F4Gs grew into, what they did, and the way they did it, and how important it was. No freaking clue whatsoever. Next question.
Okay, so there is a sort of an obvious follow-on to that, which is why the front seat influence on the F4G world didn't carry weight. So presumably when they stood up the CJ guys, there were some F4G guys there. There were some EWA guys who came across to some extent or another. But was that not enough to create the right amount of representation to remind the new incumbents of the role just how far in history the Air Force had come and how much had been spent and how much expertise had been developed?
No, because the U.S. Air Force doesn't manage human resources that way. So Dave Lucha, Santa, ended up flying F-16s, becoming a squadron commander. Did he go to a seed unit? No. Okay, Dennis Malfer, when the F-16s flew Thunderbirds and then flew afterwards, in the Viper, did he go to seed units? No. Okay, there was no deliberate and there was not enough accidental transfer from on the pilot side of the house to make a damn bit of difference.
Okay. All right. Aviation writer Joe or Av writer Joe. This you've got to rate some things here. It might be best to do this visually. We'll try and do it verbally, and if necessary, we'll share screens or something. But can you rate the following Wild Weasel aircraft? F100, F105G, F4, Tornado ECR, F16, F35, MiG-29, Su-35, and honorable mention F-15E.
Rate them on what?
Don't know. It doesn't say on which one he thinks best.
Okay, so obviously the F4 is the best looking one. Okay, the flat out ballsiest one is the F100F. The one that is entirely too oversold is the F-16. The one that distributed a whole bunch of SAM parts without being a weasel is the F-15E. The one that really had a lot of great stories and which developed the Weasel program from which everything else subsequently derived is the F-105. And the guys that try hardest with stuff that isn't designed to do what they're doing is a MiG-29.
Tornado ECR, where does that sit?
So the Tornado ECR could have been a good piece of kit if the training of the aircrew didn't suck. So I don't even that's all peace dividend stuff. They practically, when they got their chance to fly combat, they were worthless. So I'm not even going to mention them in the same way I didn't mention the Su-35. Not bad for a bunch of drunks.
Okay. Now, more from Goria. Going to... Oh, no, he wanted to add F105G, which has already been added. Okay, forget about that then. Zorro as NZL, Zorro New Zealand. I'm going to ask a really dumb question here. Is CDAD just one part of WW, or Wild Weasel? I always thought Wild Weasel was degrading that capability through force. So basically, CDAD. Is there more to it than CDAD?
So I'm going to totally attack the question differently because Zorro didn't have enough context. The mission of attacking air defenses as developed in Vietnam is Iron Hand. Wild Weasel is a subset of Iron Hand, using specially trained crews to go after radar-directed threats. That's the way it developed in Vietnam. So, EA-6As flew Iron Hand missions. F-105Ds flew Iron Hand missions. Only Wild Weasels, and those are Wild Weasel 1 is F-100F. Wild Weasel 2 was a potted mounted system on the F-4C that nobody remembers that failed and was never deployed. Wild Weasel 3 were the F-105 and the F-105G. Wild Weasel 4 was an F-4C with the embedded systems that did see time in Vietnam, sometimes called the EF-4C. Wild Weasel 5, also called the Advanced Wild Weasel, is the F-4G. Those are the only Wild Weasels, period, dot. Everything else is a defense suppression or Iron Hand asset. So Wild Weaseling is a subset of the bigger picture, and Iron Hand is a subset of what we used to call electronic combat, because the three tenets of that would be, your defense suppression in terms of hard kill, your standoff, close-in support jamming against the radar, which was the EF-111s and the A-6B's job, and then the communications jamming of the support network, which was the E-30's job.
And with that, an hour and 36 minutes in, we're done.
Is that it? We're out of questions? Well, now you can ask your follow-ups.
Well, okay. So, Maverick, that was going to be my first follow-ups, right? You sure you want to cover this now? Okay. Now, I've heard...
anyway.
I've heard you talk about Maverick on the Discord forum. So I know that you have sort of advertised its limitations, let's say. You're maybe not a massive fan of it. But I do see pictures, historical pictures. I don't think any of the ones behind me have. No, they're carrying something different. But of Wild Weasel aircraft carrying Maverick. What was the applicability of then Maverick to a CIAD or a DIAD mission that you were flying? Were you going to suppress from a distance with the harm shot? You've already said you don't like preemptive, but let's say something tracks on you, you shoot it at. Are you going to follow that up with the Maverick shot? Why would you carry Maverick, or why would you not?
You wouldn't carry Maverick because you're not doing your defense suppression job, because what you're actually doing is destruction. So it's the same reason we practice for dropping CBU and Mark 82s, is because you might need it someday and it teaches you something. What the APR-47 had was a special direct attack mode. So normally the APR-47 in general terms is looking around, sees these things, tracks them, keeps track of an amazing number of systems, and is ranging on them periodically and maintaining the picture. When you went into the close combat modes, like Rapid Ranger, all you did was put a guy off the nose, and you said, yeah, you can watch everybody else, but don't waste any time ranging on them, because the ranging algorithm takes system time. And normally the way you handle the electronic order of battle is you timeshare. Okay, but ranging takes time, and so it just goes, you range every freaking quarter second, ranging duel, ranging duel, ranging duel, ranging duel, ranging duel. That's best off the nose, and we didn't have a heads-up display, but we did end up having a green cross. So this system, at its best at low altitude, well, it's arguably whether it's best or low at low or medium, because you get a steep graze angle at medium altitude, but God, if you're going to dive in on a target, it's ugly. You want to be low for this kind of attack, is to go into point-blank range, and it gave you the green cross over the target. So in that case, theoretically, you could then use the Maverick. Keeping in mind the backseater's using the Maverick, it doesn't know where the green cross is, but if the pilot puts the green cross right in the nose and the Maverick's pointing in front of you, it should be there. The problem with that is the Maverick is ridiculously short range, and it takes up a whole station all by itself. And so you've just given up an actual, possibly more usable weapon that you can not take stupid risks with. So you train for the Maverick, and the idea behind the Maverick at the end of the day was you can still get him after you shut off. Without the consideration of, if the dude shuts off, you've done your mission, just hang around and wait to suppress the next guy that brings your electrons on the air. So there we go. But it's way too when I show you the video, because we'll talk about Mavericks. I'll probably run through this again. But I'll show you films. We're launching at 7,000 feet.
Slant range?
Yeah, slant range.
Wow. Wow, that's short. Yeah, so that's just over a mile.
Short, because the kinematic range is theoretically longer, but the ID range isn't, and you need an ID. Right? So the Seeker wasn't good enough on the Maverick to support a longer range shot. You had to get up close and personal. And by that time, at that range, you're well within AAA range, even of a 23 millimeter. The dude's eating you for lunch. Good training, though.
Notwithstanding those things, then, and not wishing to sound like I haven't understood the implications of what you're saying, I do think about the use of the Maverick infrared seeker head or a thermal seeker head by the A10 guys during Desert Storm, and them using that as a sort of a way to sort of feel their way around in the dark, in effect. Did it have any applicability like that for you as well? So if you were going to have to close in on a site, would it have been useful? Did you train for that kind of thing?
So we actually did use it as night system, but the problem was, again, it's different when you're targeting a tank and a revetment in the desert, or when you're trying to dig out that infrared significant tactical bush up against a tree line in Germany. Yeah. Because we did that. I mean, and one of the reasons you did it was so the old guys could show the new guys the tactical bush. And what it appears like. That's an IR seeker. I mean, we only ever had Ds and Gs when I was flying the Weasel, so they were both IR seekers, and seeker wasn't good enough.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and the others I will save for our F4G episode. So before we hit record, I was saying I like the picture. You were saying you've flown the jet in my picture, and I was saying I'm going to make my model, my Zukimura F4G, is arriving tomorrow. Incidentally, if anyone's a fan of making models and wants to have a chat about that, come and join the Discord. We don't have a modeling forum, but you can come and have a conversation about it. The Meng kit's supposed to be very good, but it's got some accuracy issues, I understand. Come and share your thoughts on that. But we were talking about the camouflage anyway, and I said I like this camouflage. From a practical point of view, does camouflage matter in terms of the differences between those two and the F4G's role? Because A10s that deployed Desert Storm were green, and I know that's because they didn't get the ability. They wanted to repaint them, and they were told they couldn't. But they got it. They got there. They did okay with that. I understood that when an aeroplane's more than a few miles away from you, it's just a black dot anyway, regardless pretty much of what color you paint it. So what are your thoughts?
So it definitely had a role in air-to-air because of that black dot. So the green camouflage makes you easier to see. It's high contrast in the desert, and it's high contrast in the European airspace, which has so much gray in it so much of the time because the weather's crappy. So a little bit of different condition from the Southeast Asia where that camouflage was designed for. But for an air-to-air fight, the green camouflage is just going to make you stand out. I mean, here we've got the black glossy nose behind you, and that is going to make you stand out till much later. But so the low visibility gray was absolutely the way to go for us. Much more applicable worldwide, and certainly much better in the European environment where at the time we expected to fight.
Could you?
But lizard green is freaking cool from a heritage standpoint. And so I remember flying lizard green jets and loving it because it was just a connection to all the giants that we're standing on the shoulders of.
Well, I think that's a good note on which to end things and to say to everybody, get your t-shirt. Wait a minute, I keep hiding it. There we go. Come on, buy the t-shirt. Starbaby, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that this is going to simply prompt even more questions from the audience. So we'll run the live stream, and people will have the opportunity to piggyback off of this and ask any additional questions they've got. But thank you very much for your time once again. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in to 10% True. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, hit the bell button to make sure you get notified of the next episode. Thanks, and take care.